Yeah, we have an amazing speaker with us today. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum, Fadl. This is a pleasure to have you here.
Walaikum
Um,
salam. Thank you for having me.
I've had the pleasure of reading some of your work, and I'm going to try to say as little as possible to be able to listen to you. You are going to give us a presentation on the topic that was just introduced. With the importance of phasing out fossil fuels, um, why it is important to do that in a just way and not rush towards the end, as well as focus a little bit perhaps on the role Africa has or is playing in this transition. We will listen to you for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there will be some time for questions. Jazakallah khairan, brother Fadl. I look forward to listening to you, inshallah.
Thank you, Barakallahu Fik, and thank you for the kind invitation. It's an honor and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. So without any further ado, I'll just dive into this subject, and it's a very sensitive subject, as you all know, ending the fossil fuel era, and it's sensitive for so many constituencies. It's sensitive for countries that depend on fossil fuel revenues. Many developing countries are in that position. It's also sensitive for countries that rely on fossil fuels for fueling their economy, for economic development, for economic growth. And it's sensitive because it's also a question of power. And we know how much the fossil fuel industry around the world, how much power and how much political influence and economic influence they have in shaping the direction in which we're going to move, and resisting the transition to a sustainable renewable energy system. So with that, I'll start with a reference to the Just Transition report that I had the pleasure of co-authoring with the team of independent experts on just transition and development. The team is led by our senior colleague and scholar, Dr. Yuba Sukona of Mali, who's the outgoing vice chair of the IPCC from Africa, from Mali. And the report is available on justtransitionafrica.org. Maybe somebody can drop it in the chat. And it's available in English and French. And what is unique in a sense about this report is that the fact that it attempts directly to break the silos between the literature and discussion on climate policy, on energy policy, and on development policies. And what we try to do here is to make sure that we tackle all of these challenges simultaneously. And what we articulate, and what I hope many people will begin to realize, is that climate policy is also development policy, that they're not competing sets of policies, that we can actually align them in a way that allows us to propel ourselves into a clean energy system and a sustainable and prosperous economic system without having to compromise and sacrifice. So that's kind of in way of introduction, and my remarks will reflect quite a bit of the ideas from this report. The second thing I wanted to highlight for all of us to read carefully and reflect on is the Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change, which is available online. Maybe somebody can drop the link in the chat here. You just Google Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change, which was an attempt by many Muslim scholars to bring to our attention that climate change and tackling climate change is not something that the West is responsible for. It's not something that we should, delegate to other faith groups or other cultures or other economies. It's something that is deeply embedded in our faith, in our religious beliefs as Muslims, and that it's important for us to take responsibility and to lead the world in tackling climate change, for a very simple reason, because this beautiful planet that we have is a gift in our custody. And we have a moral, ethical, religious responsibility to take care of it, not to destroy it, not to corrupt it, not to waste the gift that was given to humanity by God, and that it's important for us to do everything we can to preserve this for us and for future generations. So very important reminder that this is not bid'ah. This is a core belief and a core responsibility. And then the next item I want to bring to your attention is this report from the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, that was produced 2 or 3 years ago. It's called the Production Gap. So you can just Google the Production Gap, you'll find the report. Very simple message. What the Production Gap study does is to look at the gap between the amount of fossil fuels that we're planning to extract and burn by 2030, 2040, and the amount of fossil fuels that we're actually allowed to burn if we're going to keep our climate commitment to the 1.5 degree global warming limit by the end of the century. So if we're going to meet the climate challenge, we're not on track based on the volume of fossil fuels that we're currently extracting and burning. We're on track essentially to extract and burn double the amount we are allowed to if we're going to meet the climate challenge. And that production gap report, and all the IPCC reports, especially the last one, make it very clear that we are not going to meet the climate challenge by the end of the century unless we do 2 things immediately. The first one is to stop adding additional fossil fuel infrastructure. That is, oil rigs and pipelines and new wells. The challenge is we are currently, when I say we, it's the big fossil fuel companies around the world, are adding new infrastructure at the tune of 500 billion, sometimes up to $1 trillion of new fossil fuel infrastructure every year. So we're not moving in the right direction. Instead of slowing down and stopping the addition of fossil fuel infrastructure, we're actually stepping on the acceleration pedal and moving in the wrong direction. So we're failing on the first challenge, which is stopping to add additional fossil fuel infrastructure. What the Production Gap report and the IPCC studies essentially tell us is that we need to do a second thing in addition to stopping the addition of fossil fuel infrastructure. The second thing we're supposed to do is to design.
I'm sorry, Dr.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Very,
can you hear
very
me?
quick for the people that are not into the lingo. What is the IPCC? Could you clarify that?
Yes. Yes. Happy to do that. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the most important climate change scientific team working at the UN level to study climate change, gather all the scientific evidence, and provide summary reports for all member states of the UN. And all member states of the UN have to agree on the summary to policymakers text that they provide. So whatever the IPCC statement says, it's already something that all governments have agreed to, meaning they have agreed to the science that comes out of it, which is very important to this point. And thank you for allowing me to explain here, because that means all countries actually agree that number one, we need to stop adding fossil fuels, which is why what is happening in the last few years is unacceptable in the sense that we know what the science says, and yet we keep adding fossil fuel infrastructure as if none of the science matters, as if we don't care about the outcome for future generations, which is why there's been a tremendous initiative called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And I have the website here for you, fossilfueltreaty.org. It's an initiative that started with scientists and civil society organizations a few years ago, essentially calling on governments to sit down and negotiate an international treaty with an orderly plan to stop the addition of fossil fuel infrastructure and to phase out existing fossil fuel infrastructure with a just transition plan for countries that depend on oil and gas revenues, for countries that depend on it for energy production, and for workers, for communities that have been left behind in the existing fossil fuel system. And on this continent in Africa, 600 million people today have no access to electricity. And this is with the existing infrastructure. 970 million people, mostly women and children, are inhaling toxic fumes every day because they have no access to clean cooking technology and the energy system that goes with it. So we're talking about a system that is already failing so many people on so many levels. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, I'm happy to report, that's been gaining tremendous support from hundreds of cities around the world. Hundreds of Nobel laureates have endorsed it. Faith groups from around the world, including many Muslim organizations, have endorsed the treaty. It's been a tremendous success in civil society, scientific, faith community circles, and gradually it's been gaining traction with even nation states. So what we're hoping is that this momentum will continue and we'll finally have a clear transition plan to phase out fossil fuels, and to do that with a just compensation, with a just transition and assistance for countries and communities that need that leapfrogging moment to transition into a sustainable economic system. So that's where I wanted to start. And of course, many of you are probably familiar with the water stress issue that many countries, especially Muslim majority countries, are experiencing and will continue to experience. And water is the source of life, the source of human sustenance, and we can't neglect this particular aspect. There's a recent study by the World Bank called Groundswell. You can just Google it. It's from the World Bank, and let me underline that the World Bank here is not the most progressive organization when it comes to climate change and climate studies, and yet they were compelled to produce these estimates about the number of people that will be displaced by climate events by 2030 and by 2050. And when we talk about 2030, it's really the day after tomorrow. And I'll show you some numbers. And you can eyeball the problem here. We're talking about 216 million people who will become displaced because of climate change. You can even call them climate refugee type of category, even though the UN is still resisting the use of that term because it has very serious legal implications. But eventually we're going to have to face that challenge. And as you can see, the vast majority of the people that will be displaced will be in Muslim majority regions. Zooming in on these numbers, and it's a very carefully designed study using the most conservative approach to estimating these numbers, and it's just the volumes are unbelievable. This is a breakdown of the numbers based on a sort of a pessimistic scenario, an optimistic scenario, and a middle of the road scenario, all of which are not good at all. We're talking about north of 100 million people by 2050 that will be displaced. And the reason I highlight this displacement, because displacement of people puts pressure on the receiving communities and geographic areas, pressure in terms of the demand for housing, for food, for water, for schools, for medical services, which means it becomes a trigger for a lot of conflict. And we've seen this in the past. Every time there's displacements of communities because of conflict or because of climate events, it adds to pre-existing tensions and sometimes leads to actual conflicts. And that's something that we as a global community cannot afford to see more conflicts of that scale as we deal with so many other challenges. This is an estimate for 2030 for the North African region alone. And you can see there the bluish colors are areas where you have outward migration, and the reddish purplish colors is where the areas that will be receiving people displaced by climate events. And this is an estimate for 2030. This is not 2050. 2030, that is, as I said earlier, the day after tomorrow when it comes to the timeline for climate action. So this is not a futuristic estimate. This is stuff that is happening as we speak. And this is the 2050 estimate. It just gets more intense in Egypt and Tunisia, Algeria, and throughout Morocco as well. Adding it to a global dimension, because there's the serious inequality in terms of not just wealth, but also the responsibility for climate change and who is more responsible for taking action at a much faster and greater pace than the rest of the global economy. So here we have inequality overlapping with the CO2 emissions responsibility on a global scale. So we have the richest 10% are responsible essentially for 49% of global emissions, and it almost matches perfectly the wealth, the income distribution, where here you have the richest 10% essentially owning 52% of global wealth. And then this is the summary picture that when I present this, sometimes I ask the audience to take a selfie with this picture so they don't forget it. It's a complicated picture, but I'll explain it in very simple terms. Focus on that green line and think of dividing the world into two groups, global north and global south, rich countries and poor countries. And then we're going to net out all global financial transactions, exports, imports, interest payment, charity, remittances, all financial transactions included. The net amount between those two groups is $2 trillion. That's the latest data point we have, that on that green line, $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. So money moving in the wrong direction. This is wrong economically. This is wrong morally and ethically, that we have the most powerful, the wealthiest nations essentially continuing to extract $2 trillion a year from the poorest countries. And notice that green line has been accelerating over the last 20 years or so, which means there are existing financial and trade architectures that are designed to extract that kind of wealth from the poorest countries. So at that pace, we're not going to be able to deal with climate change, deal with inequality, deal with any of the major challenges, including climate refugees and all of that, displacement that's going to happen inevitably because of climate change. So something needs to happen to undo this financial architecture. And to understand where that extraction comes from, we have to understand the economic weaknesses that our economies in the global south have, and lay that out as part of our strategy for a just transition. And as I'll explain in a few minutes, if we try to undo those structural weaknesses and structural traps, we will be faced with a very simple pathway to leave the fossil fuel economy behind us and leapfrog into a world of possibilities and a world of sustainability. So the three structural traps are usually represented by the trade deficit and the external debt that most of our countries have. External debt meaning debt in dollars and euros, not debt in our local national currencies. So the root cause of these external debts are three major things: energy deficits, food deficits, and low value added manufacturing, industrialization. I'll explain what these mean. When I say energy deficits, by the way, I include big oil producers also in the global south. Take a country like Nigeria, for example, today imports 100% of its gasoline. Take a country like Mexico, also a big oil producer. Mexico imports 50% of its gasoline from the US. So we're locked into an energy trap where we tend to export the crude oil, the raw material, and then we import the more expensive gasoline and kerosene and other petrochemicals for economic activity. So that's one structural trap that needs to be repaired. Number two, we have food deficits, and this is true for many of the Gulf countries, but also the entire continent of Africa and many parts of the global south. Africa, for example, imports 85% of its food today. Many of the Arab Muslim countries in the region import a minimum of 50 or 60% of their food, especially the core staples like wheat and barley and corn and rice and so on. So this is a structural economic deficiency. When you take food and energy, no country in the world can function without food, without energy, period. These are the basic pillars, and we have severe weaknesses in those areas. And the third one is the most challenging one, which is we tend to be locked into the bottom of the value chain, meaning we tend to import the capital, the machinery, the fuel to produce electricity, the intermediate components, even the packaging, and we use low-cost labor and assembly line factories. And what we produce is low value-added content. So what we import is high value-added content. What we export is low value-added content. So we're always trapped at the bottom of the value chain. And these three problems, when you put them together, they create the structural trade deficit. And trade deficits create a very perverse effect that puts us in a weak position, because when you have a trade deficit, your currency weakens relative to the dollar. We call that currency depreciation. In other words, with a weaker currency, everything you need to buy the next morning, whether it's food or medicine for your people, is going to cost you more. So we end up importing inflation, and that immediately affects food and fuel, because these are some of our biggest imports. And when you have food inflation, you have the risk of instability. So what do our governments do? They're forced into a position where they have to subsidize food, they have to subsidize fuel in order to protect the most vulnerable, and in order to provide a situation of social stability, because this is very destabilizing, even politically. And what we end up doing also, we ask our central banks to borrow dollars and euros and British pounds and intervene to artificially stabilize the exchange rate to stop that inflation from happening. And when the central bank starts borrowing dollars it doesn't have, it dives deeper into that debt trap. So we're not going to tackle climate change or inequality or any of the national priorities that we have unless we go to the roots of these problems. And I'm going to keep the slide right here so we can see the problem and you can immediately recognize what the solutions ought to be. And number one, we need to invest in renewable energy sovereignty and leapfrog into a renewable energy era, even for oil-rich countries. I would argue that leapfrogging into a renewable energy era is a must, and we must escape the fossil fuel trap that we've been in. Number two, we must invest in food sovereignty and agroecology to restore food sovereignty, not necessarily at the national level, but at least at the regional, sub-regional level, to build regional resilience. And we've all seen what happened with the disruption to the shipments of grains, for example, from the Ukraine and Russia because of the recent conflict. Many of our countries were very severely exposed to food insecurity and extremely high prices, because we didn't have not even a national, but also regional. At the regional level, we didn't have resilience and regional sovereignty in terms of core food production. And number three, and the most important solution here, is moving away from the low value added manufacturing and purely extractive industries and gradually climbing up the ladder of high value added manufacturing. And the opportunity that we have here is unique and allows us to really leverage the complementarity of our resources and capabilities that we have in the Global South. Take, for example, the strategic minerals that we have, what some countries call critical minerals, all the minerals that are absolutely necessary for the high-tech industry, for the renewable energy infrastructure, solar panels and batteries and so on, for the modern version of renewable and sustainable transportation systems. All of the minerals are essentially concentrated in Africa and Latin America and some Pacific Island nations. In other words, the Global South controls essentially 100% of the minerals that are needed for the economy of the future. So we have the resources, and many of our countries, when you take the complementarity of our human capabilities, we have the scientists, we have the scholars, we have the engineers, we have the human capabilities, both in our countries, but also in the diaspora. So what we may lack is the manufacturing capability, and especially what we lack is the consensus on a political level to cooperate on industrial policies, not for exports, but industrial policies to put in place the main building blocks that every country needs, which is an energy system and a food system. So imagine an industrial strategy that gathers 20, 30, 40, 50 countries using resources and human capabilities that are complementary, and then partnering with high-tech countries and companies, say in Germany or China or the US or Japan, it doesn't matter where, as long as your partnership is based on an industrial policy that will put in place core pillars of your economy, which is a renewable energy system, which is our opportunity today. Once you put in place that, you've already solved multiple of these problems. You've solved your energy deficit problem, and you've solved your deficiency in the industrialization system that you followed. And that is the pathway that we want to see. But instead, we're constantly fed these false solutions from the mainstream economic model, which is you need to rely on austerity, cut government spending, debt restructuring, which is basically let's renegotiate the debt with a slightly lower interest, restretch the payments, but don't change anything fundamentally in the economy. Privatize state-owned enterprises, sell the telecom, sell the water company, sell the airport, the airline, and these are not transformative solutions. Labor market flexibility, that's code word that economists use to basically mean lower wages and working conditions so that you're locked even deeper in the bottom of the value chain with low-cost labor. We're told, well, you need to export more. You need to open to more foreign direct investment, FDI. What this does is if you're locked at the bottom of the value chain, it doesn't matter how much you double, triple, quadruple your exports, you're always locked into that deficiency because you export low value added, you import high value added, you're always trapped in that situation. Financial liberalization, we're told set up a mini Wall Street, and what you end up doing is essentially inviting a lot of speculators because the foundation of your economy is weak and you're artificially creating higher financial returns by manipulating interest rates and reducing your regulation. So you end up attracting exclusively speculators. This is a false solution. Tourism, which is very important, false solution for us to recognize, because when you don't have food sovereignty, when you don't have energy sovereignty, and you bring 10 million tourists, let's say, you have to feed them, which means you import food that you don't have, and you have to transport them, heat and cool the hotels for them, which means you import even more energy that you don't have. And that's why you must prioritize building those first building blocks, food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. Then tourism can be ecological, more focused on our cultural heritage and so on, rather than the kind of low-cost, disruptive tourism that we see around the world. Remittances, of course, this is a 100% result of the brain drain that we experience. If anything, we want to create, a scenario where we reverse that brain drain, and we end up essentially in a race to the bottom when we follow these more external debt, and we're not really solving any of our problems. And we're told there's no alternative. This is the only system we must accept. And these are the traps that we must undo. Again, with food sovereignty investments, renewable energy sovereignty investments, and high value-added industrialization. And again, our opportunity is in the renewable energy and high-tech sector. And if we're attached to the fossil fuel system and resist the development of renewables, then we're resisting the development of our high-tech sector, resisting the development of our high value added manufacturing sector, and we guarantee that we'll be trapped at the bottom of that value chain as a global South community. I'll give you just one example of what I mean. This is Africa's exports. Notice the amount is $585 billion. This is in 2019. I did 2019 on purpose to avoid the COVID thing. Now, you can eyeball the problem. We export raw materials, essentially in cash crops. And look at Africa's imports, $737 billion, which means we're deep in a structural deficit. And now you can eyeball the composition and the complexity, the economic complexity of the products that we import. So that's where we say the imports are high value added content, the exports are low value added content. We must escape this trap. And I can show you country after country after country in the global South. I'll just show you Ghana very quickly. You can eyeball the composition of their exports. You can quickly eyeball the composition of their imports. Permanent structural deficit that can't be undone unless we turn towards those strategic investments I mentioned. And the limitations that countries have is what I call the weak degree or the low degree of monetary sovereignty, because who's going to have the financial resources to pay for that transition? And here we can simply compare the global south and the global north in terms of the level of monetary sovereignty, which means how much spending power they have without hitting the inflation barrier, essentially, because we don't want to spend to the point where we start causing inflation, hyperinflation. So the global south has a low degree of monetary sovereignty, which means has limited spending capacity. The global south is not responsible for climate change. The global south has extremely high levels of external debt, low productive capacity to put in place even research and development capacity is very low. And of course, the global south suffers from that neo-colonial extractive economic system. Contrasted with the global north, high degree of monetary sovereignty is responsible for climate change. Let's call it climate debt to be very clear. And the concept of climate debt is very simple. There's a total volume of carbon emissions that the world is allowed to have, and the global north has already exceeded its limit and is in deficit, essentially, is accumulating a climate debt, whereas the global south has not even reached any reasonable level of CO2 emissions based on its size and its budget. And now the global south is told, you're no longer allowed to increase your emissions because we have a climate crisis that the global north actually caused. So there's a case to be made, obviously, for climate debt and climate reparations. The global north has no external debt to speak of, high productive capacity, high research and development capacity. So it has the technological resources and the financial resources to tackle climate change, and the global north is also benefiting from all of this neo-colonial extractive economic system that existed during colonial and post-colonial times. When you put the two side by side and you figure out how we're going to fix this global system, how are we going to repair it, and I spelled it out there, it's reparations, as in climate reparations, which comes in different ways. It's not all cash transfers. Yes, there will be monetary compensation, say in the form of a loss and damage fund, which the global community created last year in Egypt, the Sharm el-Sheikh, during the COP meetings. And the hope is that when we go to Dubai in a few months for the next COP meeting, that there will be a very clear agreement on who is going to put money in the loss and damage fund and who will be eligible to be a recipient of loss and damage funds and under what terms and conditions. That is probably the most challenging negotiation that's going to take place. Is going to be clearly a lot of resistance from the global north, especially the US, and the global south cannot transition in any meaningful way without substantial financial contribution. So reparations means cash in something like the loss and damage fund. Number two, it means transfer of technology so that we can transform those economies, because it's not fair to expect low-income developing countries to import solar panels from China, from Germany, from the US, and to borrow money and pay interest to install that technology. And then when it expires and becomes obsolete after 20 or 25 years, to start over again, borrow money, pay interest, and import the technology. So transfer of technology is fundamental to rebalance the global economy and allow countries in the global south to use their own natural resources with technology from the global north to start manufacturing and deploying renewable energy, creating millions of jobs, transforming their economies, becoming more independent and resilient, which should be a win-win for everybody. So transfer of technology is important. And number three, there's also debt cancellation, because it's not enough to provide cash for a just transition when at the same time we're asking countries to continue paying interest on debts that have been paid many times over for decades. So debt cancellation is critical for this transition. And finally, I wanted to zoom in on one item before I close, which is why it's important to have a global south industrial strategies and cooperation, because what we have in the global south is access to large markets, which allows us economies of scale. And this is a technical term I can explain very briefly. Industrialization requires, successful industrialization requires what we call economies of scale, meaning we have to produce large volume of units, whatever you produce, cars or bicycles or solar panels, have to produce very large volumes in order for those cost per unit. So things become cheaper when you produce larger volume. Also, the quality starts to improve, the quality of the service, research and development tends to improve with large economies of scale. And that is something that we have in the global south, because we have a large global south market and demand in that market for renewable energy infrastructure. Number two, we have the complementarity of our resources and capabilities that I mentioned earlier, which is a key component of any industrial policy. And that allows us to create these horizontal linkages and increase the creation of value added, high value added within the global south, within our economies, as opposed to simply importing that. And what we need to do with these industrial policies is start with our priorities and focus on what we call collective resilience, because a small country on its own cannot industrialize, and it doesn't have all the resources or all the capabilities. So cooperation and solidarity is critical for this just transition, by focusing on the basics: food sovereignty, renewable water security, and of course education and training, healthcare and transportation, and again, and sustainable for any functioning economy. And this is how we need to rebalance the global economy. And this is how a country military sovereignty, if you don't have these building blocks. And if you lack these building blocks, you also lack the basic level of resilience, and you have no bargaining chips. You can't walk away from any negotiation table. And as such, a country would continue to lose its economic and monetary sovereignty unless it builds those building blocks. And to conclude, and I'll wrap it back up to the show in terms of rapid action on reducing emissions, which cannot happen without phasing out fossil fuels. To the current crisis, the multiple crises that we have on climate, on inequality, on injustice, these call for bold and radical. I mean it in the literal sense of the term, which means go into the roots of the problem. That's what radical means. And if we're not tackling things at the roots, then we're really wasting our time. And one of the root causes of the climate crisis is the fossil fuel industry, which is responsible for that majority of emissions. We're not doing any radical transformation. The opposite of radical, which is going to the roots, is superficial. So if we're not phasing out fossil fuels, we're simply providing superficial solutions to the climate crisis, and that is not something that we can afford. And the current climate policies, the jobs policies, all of these policies that we've seen so far are unfortunately too weak, too slow, too expensive, ineffective, and as such, they're dangerous, because if we're not treating the problem, we're simply allowing things to get worse over time. So a realistic plan for a just transition requires, number one, a fundamental restructuring of the global trade and finance and economic architecture. And number two, it cannot happen without putting an end to the fossil fuel era. And here I want to close with this one of a couple of examples. So a just transition for all is possible, is desirable, and is actually affordable. It's the cost of doing nothing is actually much, much higher than the cost of the transition. And I'll give you a couple examples so we can illustrate on the fossil fuel transition and the need to transition away from fossil fuels for oil-rich countries, for developing countries that depend on oil to run their economy, and even for the global north, why it's important to phase out fossil fuels. So fossil fuel infrastructure that we're adding at the tune of $500 billion to $1 trillion per year when you put in place these investments, they're meant to be there and to be productive and profitable for 30 to 50 years, depending on the equipment and the infrastructure and the pipelines, which means investors that invest in an oil company or invest in a bank that's given a loan to an oil company. So those investors, they're expecting returns for the next 30 to 50 years based on the revenues from the oil and gas that will be produced. But when we realize in about 10 or 15 years that the climate events that we're continuing to see will make it very clear to every single person on this planet that we must stop fossil fuels and transition. And it will be a shock of a transition if we don't start the transition early. But once that happens, all the oil and gas infrastructure that was meant to continue producing for the next 10 years will completely shut down, which means the revenue stream for them will disappear. And that's what we call in economics and finance, we call those a stranded asset. A stranded asset, which means it's just a piece of junk. There's nothing you can gain from it, and you've lost a lot of money expecting additional revenues. Same thing when you have a hotel or a resort on a coastal property, and it becomes flooded, permanently flooded because of sea level rising. Again, that's a hotel that you expected a revenue stream for the next 30 or 40 years. And that's what the investors were counting on. All of a sudden, it's a flooded property and it brings you zero returns. Again, it's a stranded asset. So there's the physical stranded asset, and I'll close with this example. And there's the financial stranded asset that some investors holding, and this is where it affects everybody. If you're a worker and you have a pension fund, your pension fund is investing in the fossil fuel industry and will lose money from those stranded assets. If you're a student at a university, your university endowment is probably investing in climate risky assets, such as coastal properties and things like that. So all the major financial realities that connect us individually to the economy are directly affected by the risk of climate change from the fossil fuel era, from the fossil fuel economy. So the risk of stranded assets is high for oil-rich countries, for oil-poor countries that depend on the existing economic infrastructure, and for rich countries and rich countries that have big financial markets and workers and pensions and endowments and a lot of the charities around the world, including in our own countries, invest their money in financial markets, and as a result, they're directly linked to climate risks from these stranded assets. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you again for your time and for this opportunity.
Jazakallah khair for this amazing outlay, especially a very systemic outlay of how the energy transition globally affects all of us, but especially how the global community has a really important role to play within the transition in Africa as well. And it's been very painful for me. I'm in the Netherlands, and for Europe, those climate refugees have become a bargaining chip, right? A couple hundred of them drown every other week, and they have become a bargaining chip in this climate debate and in the lack of funding. And I guess that also relates to the first question I see, is that how do we convince our national governments and as well as international governments that there is perhaps also a personal or a local benefit to funding something very far away in a period where we're becoming quickly quite nationalist now that we're being asked to pay for the damages that were done in the past, right? We're closing borders. We're becoming far more right-wing in our policies. What is the story that we should tell locally, as I think mainly Western Muslims here in this community today?
I always get this question about the long term and the immediate needs and solution. I always say the long term started yesterday. It's not. It starts today. So policies and things that we need to do in order to get those long-term results, they actually start today. And to give you an example, the two of the structural traps that I talked about today, the lack of food sovereignty, the lack of energy sovereignty. When you think about small investments that we can put in place literally tomorrow morning, think of adding 1 metric ton of wheat that you produce locally. That saves you the equivalent in dollars of what you had to borrow in order to buy that. And then the interest that you have to continuously pay in dollars, sometimes for decades. So think of 1 metric ton. So just shifting a little bit of the resources that we have, the human capabilities that we have, using the precious land and water that we have locally, using the native seeds, not imported seeds and fertilizers, just 1 metric ton of additional food saves you its multiple. Now, think of doing 100, right? We're talking about 1 agricultural season. This is not like 10 years, just 1 agricultural season. We're going to commit to adding core food items at this level, right? And every single country, with some variation, has the capacity to do that. So this is not a long-term, let's hope for something happening. This can happen tomorrow morning. Same thing with renewable energy. Every green kilowatt hour we produce locally saves us the equivalent in dollars that we had to borrow and interest that we have to continuously pay. So sometimes all it takes is just being more strategic with our partners. The point is that every green kilowatt hour we produce locally saves us its multiple, plus the interest that we pay in perpetuity for the money, the dollars we have to borrow to import the energy. In many cases, you're importing fossil fuels to continue adding to the emissions and so on. So the solution is win-win. And when it comes to our responsibility as individuals, as citizens of the world, is to insist on our leaders at the local, national level to understand that we demand on the economic front local jobs and resilience. And when it comes to the ecological impact, we demand our leaders to help us leapfrog into that sustainable, clean energy system. So the responsibility of each one of us is just as important as the responsibility of leaders who should be putting in place these ideas. So the push has to come from the bottom up, as we say, from grassroots citizens groups insisting on a different kind of economic model.
Yeah. And what is I guess you, in your presentation, you outlay a lot of systemic, right? So built-in barriers. What are some of the biggest social barriers you're encountering? Is there social resistance towards this? Is there climate skepticism that makes it harder to make these steps? What are some of the social barriers?
Well, thankfully, a lot of the resistance to the science is gradually fading away. I mean, if you asked me this question maybe even 5 or 10 years ago, the answer would have been very, very pessimistic, because popular awareness and resistance to the idea of climate change was unfortunately very high. But we're gradually getting rid of that resistance. Where the resistance comes in, and people saying, I agree, this is something important we need to do, but my country has a lot of oil and we're a developing country, and that's the only source of revenues that we have, right? This is not a theoretical, hypothetical question anymore. This is the case of Ecuador as of a couple of weeks ago, when people voted. 60% of the voters decided not to drill in the Amazonian side of territories in Ecuador. And that now puts the government in a very serious financial position, where the government will be losing substantial oil revenues from those projects. And now the government is still responsible to deliver all the economic needs for their people, right? So this is a serious thing. Will the government face the challenge and build alliance? Will there be other countries coming in solidarity, supporting Ecuador as it goes through this difficult but necessary transition? These are serious questions that the world should be facing immediately. This is not a hypothetical scenario anymore. Or will Ecuador be forced to throw democracy under the bus, meaning ignore the people and their demands and continue drilling and destroying the environment? So this is a reality that many countries will begin to face in the next few years, as more citizens bring in referendum requests on this question of the climate. So where the resistance now comes in, the people say, yes, we want the clean air, clean soil, clean water, and clean environment. And yes, we need to phase out fossil fuels. But now I want you to design a very specific transition plan that guarantees my income, that guarantees my pension, guarantees my quality of life, guarantees that I have electricity, right? So these things are not going to happen just because people voted in one way or another. These things require very careful strategic planning and cooperation and technical assistance in order for us to honor the planet and its needs and honor the demands that are increasing from the people around the world. And that makes it a very serious economic challenge that can't be solved using old methods, right? The global financial architecture, the trade architecture that failed us financially in the global south, that failed us ecologically, cannot be the same architecture that will save us today. So that's why we see in a lot of the climate negotiations right now, when we talk about climate finance, we're talking about redesigning the global financial architecture, a financial system that was designed in 1944, not designed by us, not designed for us. It's not going to be the system that will fix our problems.
Our current needs. Yeah.
And
what do you, Jazakallah khair, thank you for that answer. What do you say to youth organizations in countries where the government or governmental positions are heavily funded by the industries that we're trying to phase out? There's I think that if you're speaking of social structures, there's, I think, corruption and the vested interests are a very large barrier in that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at this point, it's really about being very honest and truthful and naming and shaming companies and individuals and policymakers who ignore the science and continue to approve oil and gas investments. So if what I said earlier is correct, which is we have to phase out fossil fuels because the planet and the science requires that phase out. And number two, the second thing I said, if the oil and gas infrastructure that we're adding today at the tune of $500 billion to $1 trillion per year is going to be stranded assets in the future, financial assets and physical assets. So these are the two realities. So now the fact is that every oil and gas executive and every policymaker that approves the drilling and approves all of this, and everybody who participates in the expansion is doing one of two things. And we have to be very clear and not diplomatic about this. They're either, signing our collective suicide pact and don't care about humanity, which is what the science says, or option number two, they're duping investors, committing financial fraud, selling them financial assets that will be worth nothing in the future. And that is fraud. So it's either fraud or collective suicide pact. Either way, it's criminal and it should be treated as such.
So do you see an increase in legislative procedures in these? Is that a path that you see as a successful one?
So I mentioned the fossil fuel treaty, the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty initiative. We see parliamentarians around the world now endorsing the treaty initiative and attempting to bring proposals within their own parliaments to push their sovereign states to sit down and negotiate a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty with the international community. We see hundreds of cities around the world, in the West, in the global South, everywhere. You can see the long list on the website. Cities, municipalities passing resolutions, calling on nations to endorse a fossil fuel treaty. So that is happening, and I think it will continue to grow. The pressure will continue to grow, and the closer we get, I mean, we've seen these major disasters, the climate events that are clearly intensifying, the droughts that are clearly intensifying. These things will not get lighter. unfortunately, they will get more intense, and more people will face the reality and better understand the science, and better understand the very few options that we have left for us. And top of that list is ending the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair. Then finally, perhaps, and I appreciate you giving us a little bit more of your time. How does because you started with the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change, right? And then I think you gave us the secular, the secular story, perhaps, and that's not because it's the wrong one, because that's the narrative, right?
Yeah.
How does Islam possibly, how does Islam leverage into this transition, and how does the increased awareness of what it means to be a Khalifa, what it means to have respect for Khalqullah, how does that change this, and how do we leverage that power over the coming years to increase and perhaps even catalyze this transition?
Thank you for the question. It was very important for us to see the connections there. As all of you know, we've as a Islamic community, we've been compelled by our faith to acknowledge the importance of science, and that is from the very first word of the Quran that was delivered to our people, Iqra, and it's a call to read, to learn. And if you've read plenty of hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, it's very clear that we are always asked, as part of our religious duty almost, to understand science and to study and to try to reach the highest levels of human knowledge. And it's for the betterment of humanity, and that's part of our faith. So we can't ignore science. We can't ignore reading the science, engaging with the science, and listening to our own scientists in our own countries, right? This is not a Western discovery in terms of what the science means. And as I try to illustrate today, the science is very clear. We have to stop the expansion of fossil fuels, and we have to sit down and rapidly figuring out a plan to phase out existing fossil fuel infrastructure. Number two, as Muslims, we're also compelled to appreciate and respect the bounty that was given to us, this beautiful planet that was created with perfect balance. And these are not my words, as you know, I'm paraphrasing statements from the Quran about the importance of balance. That is not just metaphorical, but real, physical, and divine. The balance that also exists in the words of the Quran, as all of you know. So the concept of balance is very important. Number three, we've been, as Muslims, we've been also compelled by our faith, by our religion, to protect everything that was created, every single creature, right? And starting with humans, right? Human beings, that, the importance of a human life in Islam is unquestionable. And if we're looking at the science that's telling us that millions, hundreds of millions of people will be hurt, will be killed, will be displaced, will be in harm's way because of this displacement, that is clearly something that we have to take seriously, because the science is very clear, and we're compelled to protect every human life as much as we can. So for me, as an academic, kind of working in most of my life in a Western part of the planet, in a non-Muslim majority community, all of your work and ideas are presented and analyzed in a secular way, clearly. But there's no scientific question or research question that purely appears in a skeptical, in a secular universe. All of us, even those who don't believe, have some sort of ideology and an understanding of, you know, some basic principles, moral principles, ethical principles that you stand by, whether it's justice or anything like that. But for us, it's very clear, you know, what our makeup, our DNA is our culture, our religion. And when your religion is very clear about your role in protecting that balance and that perfect planet that was entrusted to us as amana, right? If that is built into your DNA, then you can't go do your scientific research or academic research without some basic motivation as to
Within your
why do I bother? Why do I need to study this instead of that? Why do I need to create more problems for myself academically in terms of getting funding, or why don't I just do the simple thing that everybody else is doing and nobody's questioning, with great funding, sometimes from the fossil fuel industry itself, right? So, but you have to have that level of integrity to choose what's important.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Qaboobie. This was amazing. This was a pleasure. Jazakallah khair for your time and your wisdom. Once again, people just please read the report. I think it will help us gain more understanding for our role to play, as well as the challenges ahead, which you laid out beautifully. Jazakallah khair, and may Allah make your work blessed and easy and successful, inshallah.
Barakallah.
I hope you have a great day, inshallah.
Thank you, Masala.